So before we get started, my name is Haris. I am the chapter director for Startup Grind X Male. This is our first event for the year, as well as the first event we are doing virtually. So we are very excited. Um, just before we start, let me just quickly go through what Startup Grind is and what we are trying to do. So Startup Grind is the largest entrepreneurial community in the world. Our main values are we believe in making friends and contact, and this is all about helping other people, especially connect with entrepreneurs and people who want to start their business. So our goal of every session is to introduce somebody who has a startup or who's active in the entrepreneur ecosystem, and to sort of get to know each other from there. Yeah. So today we are very excited to have Apo with us, and those of you from Maldives would already know Apo, or I would say at least once a week, you would be using one of the products he have built over the years, or probably daily as well. So we will see. So Apo is currently in Malaysia. He's working on a startup called RAGE. We will get into that a little bit later. So welcome, Apo, and thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to have you.
Thank you, Haris. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for you guys to invite me from Sparkhub as well, especially Jinan, Haris, and everyone at Sparkhub. I really love the work that you guys are doing right now, especially past 2 years. You guys have been involved in the startup ecosystem, and filling that gap. I think I really love the work that you guys are doing. Even far away, I see that the work you guys are doing right now is kind of making an impact on the ecosystem. So thank you for inviting me.
Oh, awesome. So before we get into all the good stuff at RAGE and what you are currently doing, just tell us a little bit about yourself. You know, where you started and what your journey have been. We understand that you are currently in Malaysia, and before that you were in the Maldives. You are working in the media industry, and that is the reason why I said every Maldivian at least once a week would be using one of the products you have built, and probably on a daily basis as well. So just tell us a little bit about your early days and how you have gone from there to Malaysia.
So I actually started off my career at Sun Online, which was in 2011. So that was right after finishing off my diploma. I came back, and after 1 month, I joined directly to Sun Online. And this was the time when Sun Online actually went from Sun FM to Sun.mv, right? And this was something big for the company as well. And I was involved at Sun Online for at least 4 years. And during this time, I was involved in building a couple of interesting things that were really challenging for big players, I must say, back in the days, right? So Javier was there, and only Javier was the only platform that was online, and there were no competitors back in the days. So we started off fresh, and I spent 4 years. During 4 years, I was able to work on a modern approach for a newspaper, built a couple of new systems like live blogging platforms, also worked on a couple of elections, mainly the presidential election and some of the complicated ones as well. And also during this time, we had a really good time, and later on I got involved as a creative editor for the company. Okay, and yeah. That's where my media career started. And obviously after that, I've shifted once towards the travel industry, and I came back to media industry, and later on I worked at Hours Online. So for me, my last working place was Hours, and it was very exciting for me as well during that time at Hours.
Yeah, good. And great. I mean, every Maldivian would agree that the media industry has brought a lot of innovative products around building online medias and data representation and stuff like that. And how did you sort of go from there to where you are right now? And after working in media industry for, I would say, nearly 10 years or 8 to 10 years, you suddenly have moved from Maldives to Malaysia. So what was, your reason for sort of moving from Maldives to Malaysia, and like, what is the reason behind that?
So, as I mentioned, when I was working at Sun and then after on at Venus, and I decided to shift my career, right? I decided to shift my focus on the industry. So I decided to work at travel industry, and I got a couple of interesting ideas from there. Worked on interesting projects there as well, and that's where you see the bottleneck, right? So at some point you see like, okay, what am I going to do next, right? So you can do something for a longest time, and then you feel like you keep on doing the same thing, right? And that's one of the reasons why I got an opportunity to uh, do a prototype for one of the applications in Malaysia initially, and that's when I got introduced to SOCAR and SOCAR CEO, and then
So
later,
Soka is the company that you started working for, right? First in Malaysia.
yeah, yeah.
So what does Soka do, and like what was your interest? I mean, I from what you just said, I understand that the market in the Maldives is a little bit limited, and there isn't much much you could do in terms of what you are doing to in few years time. So what was so interesting about Soka, and what kind of challenges were you looking into?
Obviously, during working at medias, I was handling a lot of user related. So we're talking about large user numbers, right? So talking about like 80,000 users a day, kind of websites that we have, right? And I've had that experience, and I was like, I was introduced to Soka, and I went through the Soka idea, the idea of car sharing, which was very new for me as well. So after going through that, it was very interesting, and I was invited to join the company as the second developer, as a full stack developer. And Soka, the concept of Soka is actually borrowed from Korea, and they actually introduced in Malaysia like a few months back before I joined. So it was very interesting for me, and they have a fleet of cars where you can actually book a car directly after doing your KYC. You can book a car from your app, right? And that was the other interesting part, right? I wanted to learn how the hardware worked, how things are working behind the scene. So one thing led to another. I got introduced to an interview, and then yeah, and then I finally decided, okay, it's time to take a move.
All right, perfect. And let's talk a little bit about RAGE as well. RAGE is a startup co-founded by you along with someone else as well. And how did you come up with the idea for RAGE? And could you just tell us a little bit about how RAGE came into existence?
The idea of RAID started off obviously from a coffee, and three of us, two of my co-founders and I, we were having coffee, and we were talking about how the coffee industry work, what's the life cycle of a bean, and how beans are bad after a certain day, and how, and all of that, right? And then we were talking about, how about have a platform where we do bean supply, right? And that was our initial idea, right? Not to open a cafe or a restaurant. Our initial idea was to have a marketplace where other small cafes can buy different beans and explore that, and give them an opportunity to manage those beans as a platform.
Right, and this is not just some idea that you just sit down for a cup of coffee and then try to come up with it. It is, from some of the conversation we had earlier, this came out of a problem that you had. You were saying that the coffee you tested wasn't that good,
Yeah. Yeah.
and for the Maldivians here, we have a very interesting coffee culture in the country, and for the most part we can tell a good cup of coffee versus a bad cup of coffee. And I think there is some of your senses as well in that.
Yeah.
And you said that the coffee you had tasted, bad, and then you were sort of looking into why this cup of coffee tastes bad, whereas, some coffee in another cafe
Yeah.
tastes good.
So,
And then,
so
yeah.
that was actually the idea. So we were talking about how and why the coffee tastes bad, right? And that was the initial conversation that started. And we were talking about how there is a life cycle of a bean that not an average consumer is aware of, right? And that conversation, we try to figure out, okay, if there's a life cycle for a bean, right, but does the typical cafes or normal cafes that are not specialty cafes, right, do they know about this, right? Are they aware of it? Obviously, I think if you run a cafe, you would be aware of it, but is there a system to manage that? So we were talking about a marketplace initially, and then we went out to talk to some of the vendors who were supplying beans and who were actually roasting the beans in Malaysia. So some of them were very interested in an automated platform, some of them were not. And that's how our conversation started initially. And we never thought about having an app or a
Right.
store, opening up a couple of stores. Yeah.
Yeah. So at this point, it was sort of just solving a problem of bad cup of coffee, right? How you could help somebody to make a good cup of coffee. So how did you go there from improving the cup of coffee to sort of what we see as RAGE today? Could you tell us a little bit about your journey from there and how it got transformed?
So we actually built up the data models for that marketplace as well, right? We were talking about how we would do that technically and all of that. And while we were having that conversation, we also had this side idea that, okay, once we get this out, we make some profit out of this, we would actually launch a different platform where we can have an app and that serves as a O2O, which is like online to offline business platform, right? And we were thinking about that. And while we were thinking about that, we also drew the schematics for RAGE as well. We were drawing, it was like a typical three of us gathering together and on Google Sheet, figuring out what would be the data structure for certain things, right? And three of us were very, very data oriented people, right? That data, or like, and looking at news about coffee, cafes, and what was going on. And I want to highlight about Luckin, which came across, right? During this crazy time where we were trying to figure out how do we build a marketplace, Luckin was actually catching up. And Luckin is a O2O, which is online to offline startup in China. They actually took over Starbucks, right? They were challenging big competitors. And within 2 months, Luckin actually went IPO, or went a public company, right? And this was very interesting. And we kind of picked it up at that point. We were like, okay, we can do that as well, right? So we slowly shifted our focus and went back to our vendors who were ready to provide us beans for marketplace. And we were like, hey, why don't you join with us, right? Why don't you join with us? We can become partners, and what you can provide us beans at a certain cost, and we can also start a cafe. And that's where the idea started, and that's we pivoted right away.
Right. So how did you come up with the name RAGE? Was it because you were angry with the bad cup of coffee, or what's the story behind RAGE, the name?
The story of RAGE is, where the reason why people go out and have a cup of coffee is because a lot of people we see in the office as well is that people, when they're tired, when they don't want to do anything more, they just have a cup of coffee, right? And when they're frustrated, right? And then we wanted to turn the idea of RAGE into something that is sociable, something where people can accept. And that's how the color pink came along. And it was a lot of branding involved as well. So yeah, that's how the name came to be. Like when you are raging, you want a rage coffee, right? That's the
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I mean, I saw one of the early teasers you have done, and which has a very fluid concept of I don't know. It was very abstract, but it was very fluid. So I think I get the idea now. So when you sort of pivoted from the idea of building a marketplace to what we see as RAGE today, how did you? I mean, at this point, you have spoken to the vendors. You have seen how a partnership could work. What was their sort of response first time? Because the reason I'm asking this is because often a lot of time when people have ideas, and when they sort of go and speak to people, they don't come on board that easily. Most people are reluctant. It's kind of difficult journey. So how was your experience dealing with the vendors first?
Honestly, the journey of convincing a lot of people, we had to do things on the side, right? We had to do things that we knew we would throw it away as well, right? Build stuff as well. So one weekend I was actually involved in building a system where we just wanted to convince the vendor that, look, we can do a technical thing, successfully approach this on a technical scale, right? So over one weekend I just built something, and then we went to the vendor, and the initial impression from the vendor was that, okay, see you guys in 2 months, right? And then we went back to the vendor in a week, and we were like, look, here we can actually solve this problem with a little bit of tech, right? And we showed the vendor a problem that can be solved for the vendor itself, not for us, right? Because we were still figuring out what Rage is going to be. So that was the initial stage, like there was a lot of hustling. I'll be honest.
That is very interesting, because especially I remember my previous startup grand session I had with Danish, who is also here today as a participant. When he was also speaking about his journey, one of the things he highlighted, and I still remember, is when you're sort of forming partnerships, you could, it's helpful for you if you sort of help solve their problem first. And I think that is what you have done here as well. You have sort of found their problem, and you have explained it in a way that, we could also solve your problem while we are doing something for ourselves as well. So that is, I think, super helpful. So when you started with the first Rage store, you had a flagship store in Bansa, if I remember correctly. How did you go about, raising funds for this, building this place? How did you go about that? Yeah.
So once we had the pivoted idea, as I mentioned, we actually made a deck, right? As any startup would, we made a proper deck. We looked at the financial aspect of things, right? And looking back at Luckin as well, if you look at Luckin Coffee China as an individual store, they made more money than Starbucks, right? Starbucks altogether obviously make more revenue, but if you look at an individual store for Starbucks versus Luckin makes more revenue per store. So we put up a proper deck in terms of looking at business side of things and all, and we reached out to a couple of VCs, and one of the VCs we were lucky enough to we got back from one of the VCs, and they were very interested in the idea, right? And they also had an interest in the Luckin concept as well, and which was something that everyone knew was growing really fast. So coming back to your question, how did we end up raising that money, right? And that's where we got a green signal from the VCs, and we actually raised a couple of amount of money just to book the initial store. So which was like a couple of thousands of ringgits just to book the store. By then we didn't even have VC funding. We didn't have any money. So we just had friends and family support us just to get the first store up and running, which was to pay the advance fees and all of that.
That is great. I mean, when we look back, now, and when we see things in retrospect, but by then, I mean, back then it would be a pretty huge risk, right? You're approaching to VCs, and before I ask my next question, I also want to ask, why VCs? Because usually when you are sort of raising funds for the first time, other than, friends and family, you would usually go into an angel investor or some kind of fund, other source other than VCs. For VCs is, a quite a next level step. So why VCs? What is that, you saw about this idea that could be attractive for VC? And what was your betting on this?
That was a time where the whole Luckin and O2O thing was growing and people were believing in this. So that was also the right time where there is no competition in Malaysia, honestly, at that time, right? And we were the only people with that concept, and luckily the VCs were convinced as well. And if we were to grow fast, we needed VC backing, and we were able to without. It's almost 1 year since we started our first store, right? It's May 10th. It's going to be 1 year since we launched our first store, and we knew that if we want to grow fast, we needed VC backing, and that's the reason why we reached out to VCs.
So you were ready to exploit the first mover advantage, but if there were other companies in the like if there was a competitive environment, would you do things the same way? Would you still go to a VC if there was, let's say, 5 more companies doing the same thing?
I think we would, because it's an O2O platform, and if we were to do the marketplace, we wouldn't go for a VC directly. We would initially raise some amount and try to get it going. But since it's an O2O platform, you have a lot of operations involved, you have a lot of people involved, you have physical stores, and that's where a lot of money goes as well. So we needed that backing to initially start and kick off.
Right. Cool. So your friends and family raise money, sort of act at a bridge fund until you get VC money, right? So, and once you got your first store set up, how long did it take for you to get your first customer, and how did it feel as in somebody who just came up with the fresh idea, and then what was the experience like?
Honestly, after launching the store, we launched the app around 20 days later. So we launched the store first, and we were experimenting on the app side, checking out our delivery and pickup flows and all of that. Um, uh, on launch day, obviously, we had our first couple of customers, and it was quite a hit for the store side. After launching the app, honestly, the first week, we were looking at numbers, refreshing. We only had like 180 people using the app first first or second week, and on the second month we saw a 12% bump, and on the third month we saw a 40% bump. So right now we have at least 15,000 users, right? And these are like word of mouth, I would say. Like, we haven't done a proper marketing campaign. All of the users we have acquired by now is fully word of mouth. So that was the growth for in terms of the app side.
Right. How many stores do you have right now?
Right now we have operational 12 stores, and we are actually in the process of opening the 13th one.
Right. And for a company that is less than a year old, or almost 1 year old, that is, I think, quite some amount of stores. And
Yeah.
again, it sort of depends on how the industry is growing as well. But when you started this, did you get as many customers as you hoped to? Did the growth go as you projected?
Yes, we projected to make to break even within a year, and we have actually reached the break even point. To be honest, before the COVID-19 crisis, we have actually reached that point. And I think coming back to the projection part, we rely all the decision on data. So it's not like a typical typical cafe style where someone decides, okay, let's open up a cafe next door, right? We rely a lot on data. Since we have the app, we leverage that power, right? And we look at where users open our app. If someone has used our app at Bangsa area, for example, right? Let's say if you think about in Malay perspective, if someone uses our app at Hemberu and they open the app at Hulumale, we know that there's demand in Hulumale, because the reason why someone is opening the app in Hulumale is because they want to see a RAGE store there. And we harness the data properly. We look at the data. We have a proper dashboard that three of us go through every day. We look at where the signups are coming from, where people are interested in. And we've seen a couple of interesting cases in Singapore as well popping up, where people who travel from Malaysia to Singapore opening up the app just to see that whether RAGE exists in Singapore as well. So we see that we have created that demand. So that's the kind of data that we harness, and we try to open our next store based on the density.
That is very interesting, and I think that could be one of the reasons why RAGE has break even so early, because
Yeah.
you are not just opening up stores in every road you see. You're looking into where RAGE customers are looking for. I mean, and then you're storing you're opening up store right there in the hotspot itself. So that has worked very well for you. Um, if I remember correctly, when you started RAGE, you were also working at Lottie Files with Nattu and Chafu as well, and juggling the work from Soka, Lottie Files, and RAGE, this new idea back then. How did you manage all of these things, and what were the compromises you had to make to sort of come where you are right now?
Honestly, I would say last year was very hectic for me. For first 2 quarters of last year was very hectic. yes, I started helping Nattu and Shafi around January, February time, working on the new Loti website, help them with a couple of things on as a freelancer. And while doing that during my weekend, so all of these things are weekend projects. So during my weekends, I was working on Rage, building Rage, and figuring out what to do with Rage. And weekdays, I have a full time job where those days I had to figure out who are the people I was hiring for my team, because uh, get, Soka was preparing to launch a different product, and which is totally different from Soka as well. So I had the responsibility to hire people for that product. And I was involved in a lot of meetings back in the days. And I also had to hire people, get a team together during weekdays and build a product. So even that product became successful, and we recently launched that as well. So it was very hectic. And that's when I decided, okay, I need to minimize the workload. And that's why I stepped away from Loti, because I was doing anyway some side works there. So, and I've started focusing fully on Rage since August. So
Yeah,
yeah,
how long did it take for you to launch RAGE, from ideation to implementation? How did it take? And, what's your sort of opinion or take on how long does it have to, for how long does it need for a startup to launch their first version of the product?
I think a lot of people who jump into building new products, they miss the mark of MVP, minimum viable product, right? And I wouldn't even to this day claim that Rage is a perfect app, right? You see that some people have trouble with certain things as well, right? So it actually took me around 1.5 months to launch from uh, starting first day of coding to launching the app.
That
And
is great. Yeah. And the reason why, again, I want to emphasize on this more is because I see a lot of people working on ideas, but they never launch, right? They want to wait until they build the perfect product. And that is something impossible today, because customers' behaviors are changing all the time. And you can't, just build the perfect product one day and launch. So when you launch the first version of your product, I'm pretty sure there would be a lot of things you have sort of not done, and that you are willing to do over the next couple of weeks. So could you just give us a little bit about your product development process, how you sort of roll out the future and then features, and then how you sort of kept improving your product based on customers' behaviors and their feedback?
so for me, after launching the app, that was the most challenging part, right? Launching the app itself was easy because you have to build an MVP, which was pretty easy, right? Building an MVP, launching it out. But the challenge started after launching, obviously. Figuring out how to scalability was in question as well, right? Where do you change? And every week I was launching. If you look back at Rage update history, you can see that during the launch period, I've updated the app every week. So every weekend, I work on app updates and look at the bugs and try to fix them. And then also go to the operations teams and figure out what are the struggle that they're going through as well, right? Because this is again a product that they are dealing with as well. So I work closely with the operation team and figure out the struggles, go back to customer reviews, listen to the customers, like have it experimented around, give people to install the Rage app just for the heck of it, just to see uh, how they react to the app, right? So I was going through all of these things during that time, early days. So I would say first 3-4 months, that was a huge struggle. You have to constantly look into feedback, constantly improve, constantly rewire back something you thought that was perfect, but you had to rewire it back so that it's more scalable.
Yeah, good. And one of the reasons why a lot of companies, especially startups and new entrepreneurial ventures, fail is because they build things people doesn't want to use. They
Yeah.
actually don't solve their problems. So when you were building Red, and obviously you would also have some great ideas, you thought to yourself is great, or you thought that customers are doing things this certain way. So could you tell us about an experience, where how your assumption was, not correct, and how you went about it?
I think at one point we thought uh, we had for the longest time we had the assumption that we can do micro deliveries, and we were wrong about it, right? During the COVID crisis, we came to realize that okay, we cannot do micro deliveries. We need to think about macro level, and our whole focus of the app was to do micro deliveries. So that means wherever our stores are, we do deliveries within 500 meters. That was our plan, right? So walking distance, anyone can deliver. uh, the second feature that we thought about implementing an idea where you can have a community of people who has talent, and you can explore those talents and invite them to a coffee, right? And which is the social aspect of things, and this is somewhere that we haven't touched yet properly. So this is going to be something that we thought that's going to work out, but we decided we will push back because we still want to focus on the main product, which is ordering a cup of coffee. And we go by this mantra that you can just tap drink rage, right? So after your first order, it's just 2 taps away from your next coffee. So that we started focusing on that. Three of us had big ideas that we wanted to do. Two of them came from Uber, and they had that experience as well, a lot of data back in them as well. So we decided, okay, at one point, okay, we need to focus on the product, make sure that things on the product scale are working, grand grand scheme of things are working perfectly. So right now we're focusing on that. We still have those big dreams that we want to do as the team
Yeah.
grows.
Yeah. So again, just to highlight on that one more time, often maybe sometimes your customer is wrong. You are right, but still customer is wrong. How would you go about something like that when you are sort of building your product? You know the right way, but the customer is demanding the wrong way. Would you do it your way, or would you do it the way your customer wants, and why?
I think it depends on the number of queries you get from customer experience, right? I would never rely word of mouth for one customer. So there should be data backing a claim, right? And this is something that I think compared to Maldives, in Malaysia, a lot of people rely on data. And surprisingly, if you ask me, right, at Soka, let's talk about Soka as well, right? At Soka, everybody in the company does SQL. People in marketing does SQL. The CEO does SQL. So these are like data heavy people. They live on data. So that means coming back to Rage as well, I would need data back in that. So even if I get a query from my marketing team or the customer relation team, I would actually tell them, okay, let's look at the data, right? So we do
Right.
log every process of the user. So maybe the user is wrong at some point, but somebody needs to guide them. And then if we were not able to guide them properly, then that means an experience problem, right? And that's something that I need to attend. So those are the way how we validate uh,
Yeah.
uh,
So
uh,
all your processes are backed by data, all your assumptions are validated through data. And let's talk a little bit about how you have used referrals to sort of grow the audience of Rage. And referrals again is a very interesting thing to me because in the early days of startups, especially late 90s or early 2000s, a lot of companies use referrals as a mechanism to sort of grow their audience. For example, PayPal use referrals, Gmail use referrals, and it worked really well. But we don't see as many referrals today as we used to see. And why was your reason for using referrals? And referrals itself has a cost, right? When
yeah.
you're sort of, let's say, inviting somebody to Rage and giving them, I don't know, 50 ringgits, for example, to try out, that itself is a cost for you. And especially if you're scaling out, if you're growth oriented, and if you have a lot of users, it's a huge cost for you. So how do you balance these costs out, and how did you go about that?
So one thing I mentioned earlier about having a vendor who supplies beans for you at cost is very important, right? Like you need to have that business side of things figured out, right? So that's where we lower the cost of a cup to a point where we know that we are willing to take that additional cost on. Maybe like additional cost on payment gateways, right? Maybe we want to have a proper payment gateway. We are willing to pay that extra amount for the payment gateway. And for as far as I know, we haven't done proper marketing campaigns. So that money that we would spend on marketing campaign is much more reliable if we spend it on referrals. And that's the reason why, as I mentioned, right, first month or first week, first 2 weeks, we had around 200 400 users, and then that grew so fast because as soon as we launched the app, the second feature that I launched was referrals. And referrals, actually, people, whenever they invite someone and when they successfully make an order. So let's say, for example, if I invite you and if you successfully make an order, then then I get 10 ringgits and you get that 10 ringgit promo. So that's the way. So there is always a backlog of payment
Right.
happening before we pay up
So,
for it.
yeah, so you sort of calculate in the average, the lifetime value of a customer, how you would get on average, and then, sort of allocate in a percentage of that to referrals.
Yeah.
That one is a very smart way. Um, let let's talk a little bit about COVID and how it has impacted your operations at Rage and what you have done sort of to manage during these difficult and uncertain times.
I think COVID has impacted almost all of F&B industry, to be honest. And it's not just Rage, but we see that a lot of businesses that had a drop of around 60 to 50% revenue, right, because of COVID. And we decided to pivot right away. So we are in the pivot stage. Even today, I was working on a new feature. So we are ready to pivot at any time. And the difference is that I would say people here, especially in the F&B industry and any other economical area, if you look at, people are willing to fight for it, right? People are willing to fight to survive their businesses. So as for Rage as well, we are willing to give it a fight. We are willing to give it a fight until we go through that smooth transition and actually maintain our user base. So just to entertain our users and all, we're working towards some new features where people are more health centric these days, more health conscious. So we want to introduce more health related products to the platform, right? And then how whether we can use that as an idea to grow the platform as well. So we're looking at different areas, and this gives honestly, COVID has given us more opportunity to look into ideas that we left back, so that we can explore and start testing on that.
Great. Yeah. I remember like when we spoke earlier, you like the whole adding the healthy juice option to on a subscription basis
Yeah.
to sort of take advantage of the COVID situation so that right now you can't use your stores, right? There are no physical walk-in customers. So you're going to leverage on the virtual networks and do more deliveries and things like that.
Honestly, as I mentioned earlier about how we know the location of the users and where they have usually been. So we were also thinking about different ideas where, like we rent a car and stock all of our cold brew drinks and all the cold beverages to the car, and which is something called Rage on Wheels, right? Which is something that we are looking into. So we send out a crew to different districts. Let's say one in Montclair, one in Damansara, and different areas, and those cars would be stationed in that area. So once those guys go to that area, they can activate a beamer so that all the Rage customers in that area would know, okay, your favorite cold brews are within
Yeah.
reachable, right? And which is like 5 minutes away. So which is something that we're exploring right now. So some of the actually the COVID crisis has given us more chances to explore on these things, because right now we're operating on only on 2 store at the moment, and we are not on the full scale. We're not running Rage on full scale. So we want to explore all of these ideas without giving up, honestly.
Right, great. So, whichever difficulty it is, there's something you can still do to take advantage of that. What is, the size of your team and, how have, has your team grown in the past year or has it remained the same?
I think in terms of the team, we are now beyond 60 plus people, but mostly on operations and admin side and all of that. So we have around key 6 people who are involved in day to day running the business. And yeah, rest of the people are baristas who have been with us from the beginning, and then we have some part-timers as well.
Right. Perfect. And how much, money when what percentage of money have you spent on building the platform, the tech component, versus how much are you spending on, stores and other stuff? And what do you think is the most important aspect of your business? Is it the platform, or is it the physical store, or is it a combination?
So we always present ourselves as a tech company. We do not present ourselves as a cafe. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the app is growing in a way that we have a user group that is committed to us, right? They're committed to the Rage idea, the Rage concept, and all. And we want to use that user base to grow on other areas. So obviously, Rage is not going to be just exclusive for Rage brand itself. So we're looking at options where we want to become the platform that is used to order caffeinated drinks. That's our whole idea, right? And we want to grow from that. So we don't want just our physical stores to be uh, the ones that rely on our platform.
All right, great. So before we get into the Q&A section, just to see what our participants have or what kind of questions they have, let's talk a little bit about the startup scene of Maldives, at the whole ecosystem in general. And in your opinion, what has changed sort of in the past 10 years, and where do you see Maldives startup ecosystem in the next few years? What kind of opportunities do you see, or what kind of advice would you give to people who are trying to create a new business in the Maldives?
I've honestly seen a couple of startups a few years back that were very interesting, right? We had Patike, Makumbe, if you talk about from the food side. We also had, if you look at few more years back, right? Like I think we were very young back then, but I can remember one startup that Shafi launched, which was Mo, which was a live streaming platform, right? Everyone is live streaming these days, and
Yeah.
surprisingly,
It was Facebook Live 10 years ago. I mean, 10
yeah,
years ago, before it came.
exactly.
With
And
crappy smartphones, they couldn't do it.
and it was very impressive, right? Nobody looked into these potential startups that were happening in Maldives, right? So I think all of these startups that I mentioned are no more, right? And it's quite sad to say that as well, because maybe back then they didn't have uh, the platforms to grow on, right? Or support that they needed. So I think the current startup ecosystem, obviously with you guys involved in the ecosystem as well, I think people are much more aware that startup ecosystem should exist in this country, right? And we have very smart people. I've seen a lot of smart people in Maldives, and if you ask me, even in Malaysia, if you compare Maldivian developers to other developers in not just in Soka but in other companies as well, they stand out, right? And the only reason why we stand out is because in Maldives we do everything all by ourselves, right? We do the product building, we do the UI designing, we do the development and all, and we have that experience where no other country or no other people have. So um, as I think the startup scene in Maldives should be given more opportunity, right? There should be an option where we should consider that startup scene is part of the economy as well.
Yeah.
If you ask me, right? Because if even if I look at today the Maldivian developers group on Telegram, we have around 400 people there, and those are 400 potential startups. Or if you divide that by two, those are at least around 100 or 200 startups that could potentially, if people like invested in these kids, invested in people, right? And I think one thing people should look at is you need to invest in people as well, right? Take care of the people. And that's the only way people will remain in Maldives, right? You should take care of your developers, people who are building your products, right? These are important people. You have to listen to them as well, right? And one thing I learned is that if you try to build something from data oriented, as I mentioned, right? And I get this experience from Soka as well, and I get this experience from Rage as well. If you build your company based on data, you are definitely going to succeed on whatever you're doing.
Yeah. And one more thing I just want to ask you is about, you know, when somebody's coming with an idea, it's often the ones I see are very limited to Maldives as well. And I think the reason is because they don't think, or they don't know how to take it far from Maldives. And you have mentioned that you raised, you know, funds from a VC in Singapore, right? You're based in Malaysia. You have raised a fund in Singapore. So, do you think it is also possible for, you know, startup people who are creating their companies in Maldives to go for a route like that? Could they, you know, tap into funds elsewhere, or how would you say they should go about it?
I think first getting an MVP out, get the concept out, which is very important. Building, right? Like get something out there, right? Secondly, once you believe in the idea, you will figure out all the business side of things, right? Honestly, I didn't have a clue what to do with the cafe, right? I've never run a cafe. I wouldn't even say I'm a coffee person to begin with, right? I wouldn't say like I'm a coffee expert, right? But once you get into that business, once you look at that data, and once you kick off something, you will get involved with the product and take the ownership. So in my opinion, I, I'm pretty sure that even if Maldivian startup which is focused towards um, worldwide or like international, I'm pretty sure people will catch on it. We just need to get more things out there. And the reason why it's stopping again is because we don't have the platforms that support the Maldivian kids or Maldivians that are trying to build things, right? So uh, there needs to be some changes in terms of how we look at startups as well, how we promote startups as well locally, and then only we can go globally. And
Right.
I'm pretty sure like we if you look at Lottie files, right, that's a proof that uh, Maldivians working can definitely build international products. So
Globally
uh,
scalable product,
global
exactly.
scale. So I don't have any doubts about that.
Perfect. So we are starting the Q&A session right now. Some people are sending questions. Apo, can you see the questions, or is it just me?
I do not see.
You do not see. All right. So we have one question from Shinaw. I hope it's okay saying your name. Um, the question is, what are the challenges for Maldivian startup? Is it technical or financial, or, you know, resources, or is it, you know, the culture here in the Maldives? So
I think one challenge we have is obviously technical and more of from a policy aspect, right? So technical in the sense uh, because there are guys like you guys in the ecosystem, so technical part of things are uh, getting solved. But if you look at policy side, I think there needs to be more strict policies where the government actually supports the startup ecosystem and push the startup ecosystem, and people involved in the startup system ecosystem allow them to grow, right? And we had seen some incubators early on. Few years back we have seen incubators, but we haven't really seen any success rate on that, right? Maybe it's because none of it was given that care that needed. So I think we need to start that incubation process from a government level. And even in Malaysia, a lot of startups in Malaysia are also uh, funded by the government itself. So, and we have seen other uh, foreigners who are involved in startup scene who get funded by the Malaysian government itself because they believe in the startup ecosystem. So I think number one I want to highlight is we need a policy. Secondly, I think we need to have a structure and a system how we can implement these policies. It's not just because we don't have paper, or it's not just because we don't have a certain service in Maldives. And if a lot of people, when asked about startup, they talk about paper, right? Well, I see that as just a uh, just an excuse, right? Because I want to highlight that because if you build something locally, right, like Haris and guys, you guys are doing pair, right? And if you have something built locally, believe in the local product first, and then think about what you're going to do with international partners, right? If you have a strong product that's working well locally, definitely people who are in the international market, like PayPal or Stripe, would definitely jump into the game, right? And that's good. And if you look at any country, you see, if you look at India as well, and if you look at any other country, you see that locals will always support their local products. So, and it's better to grow locally than focus on international products if you're looking at the local ecosystem.
Right. So in other words, in short, Maldives is a good market to pilot and test a product, and then take it globally and scale it globally. Yeah, we have another question from Zia. Um, how is the business cost on the perspective of running the tech for, I assume, for RAGE, like the server cost? Usually, tech businesses fail due to unmet balance in cost.
I think I have that has never been something that stopped us. If we are to spend even more money on server cost or even on the tech side, that has never stopped us until today. It has never stopped us. So we never looked at our AWS balance and say, okay, look, the AWS bill is growing or something like that, because we are a tech company, right? If you're a tech company, obviously you have to have servers, you need to have servers to test and all of that. So I think that's a cost you need to be ready to bear.
Yeah, and just on AWS and server cost, I would like to highlight that if there's anybody who's here, worried about server costs and getting that tech costs uncovered, Sparkhub is a program in partnership with AWS. We provide up to $5,000 credit for anybody who wants to start their business. So if you are worried about getting your tech costs covered, just reach out to us, and then we can help you get that covered. And from my experience in relation to tech costs, especially AWS, there are a lot of programs out there on the web that gives you as high as $20,000 in AWS credit. So we could leverage into things like that on covering credits related to AWS. Let's take another question. Apo, do you see the questions?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I do
Why
see
don't
the
you take a
now.
question from there? Yeah.
So why do I think that people are afraid of to share their ideas, right? And one thing I think is people need to share more. People need to share more. People need to do more partnership. And I'll tell you, the reason why Rage has 12 stores today is because of partnership. Otherwise, we would have at least 5 stores or 4 stores by now. And people need to open up their ideas, like be open to involve others, be open enough to invite other platforms, experiment them. And especially I see that that's a case where people are very close with their ideas. They draw a circle and they remain within that circle with their idea, and the idea actually dies with them, right? And if you don't share your ideas, you won't find like-minded people who are willing to invest that time with you. So you need to open up your ideas. That's the reason why we started Rage, right? Unless we had that discussion about discussion at a cup of coffee, we wouldn't even know that, okay, there is a problem to be solved, right? And obviously the startup ecosystem, we solve problems, and if you build a product that solves problem, then obviously there will be some amount of people who are willing to use that.
I think you have 2 more questions at the beginning, right? From Mikdam and Afra.
Mikdam, I honestly didn't understand that question well. If you could, give some more details on that question, that would be great.
But I think we can take the one from Afra, right? What's your view on tackling the
Yes.
scalability?
Yeah.
I think scalability wise, I think we have operation. I think from maybe you're coming from more of a cafe aspect, I guess, with tech, right? I think there is an operational cost, right? Anyone can build a product, but how do you handle the operation costs that come after that product, right? If your product is fully online and not offline, then you have a less cost. Just as someone mentioned earlier, you only have the AWS cost, right? But I think you will have to, uh, you know, uh, scale based on uh, the user base you get, and you should be willing to deal with that scale. And that's one reason why some of the startups we mentioned earlier, that's the reason why they couldn't, or like one day they launch and it becomes so famous that they cannot scale, right? Let's say, for example, I start with a food delivery service with 2 people to deliver food, but tomorrow it becomes so popular that the application is not able to scale, and then you have negative feedback, and you're bound to step back because of you see that failure first. So I think you should be willing to see the scale.
We also have a question from Danish about COVID again. How are you dealing with the fall of revenue during COVID? What are you doing to survive? I mean, I assume other than the ones we discussed, are you doing any cost cutting?
Yes. So we have currently we are paying everyone salaries and all of that, but we will be obviously we had some of part timers, so some of them have stopped, unfortunately. But in terms of obviously there's a revenue dip, and right now we're focusing on how we can as soon as the MCO, the movement control order in Malaysia stuff, we want to see how we can come back to the game as soon as possible. So that's what we are planning on right now. Obviously, there's a revenue dip, and everyone sees that number, and it's a scary number. But we don't want to look at that for now, and we want to see like what we can do beyond that. So that's the reason why I'm working on pivots every week and working on figuring out what are the new ideas that we can implement to avoid the revenue.
Cool.
I think Mikdam has now come up with this question again, right? I think what he's trying to ask basically is like, what's the stages of how a startup graduate from different layers before it actually goes into an acceleration program? So like, they go into incubation, pre-incubation, and then they go.
Yeah.
So I think that's the question. How is that different phases?
I think you need an accelerator program if you're like 2 people trying to validate an idea, right? And that's where the accelerator program is important, because you get compensated for the time that you spend, as well as you also get time to spend on that platform that you want to build, right? It can be a digital or an offline platform as well. So that's the importance of an accelerator program, so that someone who believes on your product will help you get there. And the other reason is accelerator programs. You have programs where people are willing to pay you for your idea for a certain time until you figure it out or validate the idea. Another reason with an accelerator program is you will have mentors. So mentorship is very important. So you need to go to people who are involved in industries which may or may not be related to your industry and get mentorship from them. And that's something we see a lot in Malaysia, where we have, like if you look at any subject, we have different conferences, different meetups, and that's where you meet people who have done something cool and uh, something that's outstanding, and you can get to go and talk to these people, and an accelerator program would help you reach that people directly. So that's also very important, I think. And the phases you identify is that once you validate the idea and that it works, and it's time to get out of the accelerator program and time to get on your feet, find funding if you need it, and to actually go and deploy that product.
I have again a private question sent to me. I will check this one. Do you think that athleisure clothing would be a good startup for Maldives, and any advice on how a person should act on a similar startup? And Appa, when you're answering this one, I think it would be helpful for a lot of people if you could sort of generalize as well for anybody who have a startup idea and how they should go about it. And this question is in specific to athleisure clothing.
Athleisure?
Yeah, I think that is what it is.
Okay.
I suppose athletic sports kind of clothes.
Okay. Athletic. I think I'm very unfamiliar with that industry, but I would say like if you have enough data backing, and I think this is the perfect time to start in something related to athletics or sporting, right? We're talking about sports industry and how we can connect that from a technical aspect, right? You see a lot of people, a lot of gyms going offline, and you have people doing exercises in front of the camera, and there is already a platform that's missing out, or there are platforms that are not noticed as well, if you look at locally as well. So I think it's a good time to launch something like that.
Right. Again, there's one more question right after that. Tech ideas towards building businesses obviously takes some investment, often because lack of scalability. It is risky to go into these investments.
So for tech startups, I think a lot of businessmen, they want to do a startup, right? And then they look at someone who can build them the product. And these people are temporary people, right? And that's the reason why you need a tech co-founder, right? This is something people miss out a lot. You need a tech co-founder for someone to remain with you throughout the journey, right? And if you give someone to build a platform, that's like consulting or giving someone a freelance work and they just deliver something and you call it a startup, right? That's not a startup. That's actually you're asking someone to build something for you and just launching it. And you will face so much problems with that kind of an approach, because the importance of having a tech co-founder is very important. You need a tech co-founder. So yeah, I think having a tech co-founder is the point that we all miss out. I think in Maldives as well. And
I think as well as, when you're raising investment, I think it's also important that you have a long-term plan. What do you think, Apo? Just in relation to that question.
Yes, I think it's very important because investors also want to see who are the people involved in the tech side, what their experience, what are the products they have built, right? And they want to like connect the dots, right? For example, someone can go and pitch a business idea, but it doesn't mean that they have the tech backing that idea. So you need someone who would be there to back the idea and who would be there in the long run. So I think that's something investors look into as well.
Right. Perfect. The next question we have from Karan. How do you think we can convince policymakers to believe in startup ecosystem if policy is the barrier to entry and growth?
I think honestly, we should look back and show them all the startups that had the potential to grow and that failed because of policies, right? You see all the startups that died during past 5 years, and we should show them like, look, if we had potentially this startup today, we as an ecosystem, as a startup ecosystem, as a country, it would have been much more beneficial. I think that's the first starting point. You look at the failure stories, right? You need to look at the failure stories and talk about them, right? And whether government from a government side or whether that comes from guys like you from Sparkhub, someone needs to convey the message of failed stories as well, failed startup. Someone might have wanted to do something very simple, right? And that also failed out probably because he believed that there was nobody to help him with the data, right? So these are things that we need to talk about, and we need to convey that message to policymakers that look, there are potential startups that could have worked out and that failed. And secondly, because of these policies and things, people are moving abroad, people are moving towards different direction. A lot of people, if you ask me, in Maldives have studied software engineering, and they are forced to work in the IT labor area, right? Like they're forced to do IT jobs because the opportunity is not created for them, right? Even if you look at the government side, a job description, it would ask someone to do a list of things that you would actually expect from four people to do, but that's the current scenario that we need to believe in. That's the current scenario, so that needs to change.
But do you honestly think showing them failure is the way to go?
I think so. Talking about failure is very important, I think, in any startup ecosystem. If you don't talk about failures, then there's no story to inspire people. Successful stories may die next day as well, right? So you need to show them why a startup failed, and that's something people need to look into.
Right. The next question we have from Nattu. How important is it to go lean at the beginning of a startup?
I think lean startup is very important. I think if you don't do lean, then you are bound to burn out, right? And you don't want burnout. You want a startup if you're starting something by yourself, for instance, right? Maybe initially you're starting without any funding. You want to explore what to do with your startup, how your product is going to evolve, and you see the big picture. Sometimes what happens to us is we see the big picture, and we don't do an MVP, we do a full-blown product, and then end of the day we end up being disappointed about it because nobody ends up using our full-blown product ideas, right? And for example, even if you look at the current situation in Maldives, right? I see that a lot of e-commerce platforms are born out of nowhere, right? And that's good. That's a good thing. But do we see people actually approaching the problem, right? The problem itself is people are trying to send Viber messages to stores to send their list of products, right? And people are not solving that problem, right? You need to first solve a problem, and while solving that problem, you need to build a bigger platform. So I think it's a very important thing to always go lean and always to have a very minimum viable product initially to test out your theories, to validate your ideas.
Perfect. Again, we have something related to policy from Mustafa. If policy is an issue, instead of waiting for the government, is there a path you think the community can take and organize itself to support the further startup ecosystem here?
I honestly think that that's where Sparkhub comes in, and that's where the part where you guys are doing. You guys act as a voice for the startups, and I think communities or organizations like that would actually lobby the ideas, right, to push the policymakers to make the policies. The reason why I'm highlighting policy is because policy is very important to sustain a startup, right? It's not because one day you and me just decide to launch a startup, but how do we see the security of that startup, right? It may not be a financial related startup. It may not even be something related to uh, products, right? Like if you look at some industries, we don't even have a startup. If you look at fisheries, right? If you look at fisheries, we don't have a startup that can help, for example, figure out an atoll, to figure out how many donis need to go out in order to cater that need for that community, and then what is the excess amount of fishes that they actually catch that needs to go out for exporting, right? If you look at industries like that, nobody's solving those problems. So how do we solve those problems, right? And by policies, I want to highlight that first thing is we need to be more open with the data, right? This is something we all have talked about during past couple of hackathons as well, right? Like we have advocated for openness of data, openness of certain data, and having an open data.gov.mb, something like that, right? And if you look at different countries as well, having that opportunity to access data might create more startups as well. That's just the first step of things, I think.
Great. The next question we have is from Ahmed Riazi Muhammad. What's the key qualities we should look in a co-founder, or what are the key skills that a founder team should have?
I think honestly, you should be willing. First of all, be willing to fail, and you should be willing to look at be willing to struggle, and you should be willing to hustle as well, right? If you're not hustling, if you're not willing to grind that extra hours, I think you could be a business partner. You wouldn't be a co-founder. A founder itself is someone who builds the founding block uh, of of, of a product, and they actually bear that cost of the initial struggle. So you should have those qualities. I think you should be willing to crunch that extra hours on building and spending time on with your side project or whatever that you're working on.
Again, we have one more question about RAGE. Can you give a short rundown of RAGE business model? Are coffee roasted by RAGE or suppliers? It seems like this participant joined a bit late when you mentioned about the supplier part.
Yeah. So currently, RAGE, we have a supply partnership with VCR. VCR is a cafe and a roaster in Malaysia, and they're pretty big in Malaysia. And they roast beans for around 1/4 of the cafes in Malaysia, or KL alone. So we have a really good partner in hand. So we have a really good working relationship with them. So they supply our beans, and obviously we actually roast customized beans. So we have our own flavors. So we actually send them our requirement, and we do the testing and all of that from our side.
Right. We have one more question from Mohammad Riazi Muhammad. It's about falling in love with the problem versus solution. I think this is something very, very often we come across. A lot of founders are in love with the solution because they are excited about some new tech, some new way of building a product, but they are not actually, solving any problem. So what is your thought on, falling in love with the solution versus problem?
I think for me, I was in between that scenario when we launched Rage, right? And then later on, obviously, we had problems, right? And technical problems, not making coffee or not delivering the coffee or anything related to operation side, more on tech side, right? And I was the only person who was involved in building the product from ground up. So for me, that was it was very important that I need to move past the problem. So I look at the data of crashes every day. I look at why someone had difficulty in ordering, what can be improved. It may not be something technical, but it may be something like a user experience improvement as well. So I think it's important to move away from, like, okay, I launched a product, right? And you don't really get to look at that product all the time because it needs to change. It needs to adapt to the new users that you had, and it needs to adapt to the problems that you face, just like what we are facing right now with the COVID crisis as well.
Cool. That is all the questions we have. If I have missed any questions, just ping us on the chat box and we'll ask the questions. If there aren't any more questions, I think that's all.
Yeah.
Right. We got a very interesting question. If Apo was a cartoon character, who would it be and why?
I think I would be Dexter. That's very interesting. Yeah, I think I would be Dexter. I don't know.
All right. So
I don't think there's any more questions coming up. So maybe.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us. It's been great. I honestly we got a better response than I anticipated. So thank you all for joining us, and hope to see you all in our next event as well.
Yeah, we'll be calling an event very soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me, guys.
Thank you for joining us.
About Rage and my experience as well.